Today we're going to be looking at Chapter 13 concerning correctional history and the structure of the correctional system in the United States today. Much like with our policing and courts history, our history with the correctional system comes from Europe, mostly from England. Early American corrections was based heavily on physical punishment, on fines. There wasn't that much focus on incarcerating individuals, though we did have two separate systems originate in the United States with regards to corrections. The first we'll talk about is the Pennsylvania system, which was developed in Pennsylvania, as you might have guessed. William Penn was the founder of Pennsylvania. Brought a very heavily religious sentiment to the state. The Quaker religion, very strict religious sect, and basically took some of the elements from the European system, from the English system that was in place, and incorporated a very heavy dose of religious influence. What the Pennsylvania system looked like: the individuals were kept separate in solitary confinement, basically in a setup what is called a panopticon, where you have one central guard that can view a vast number of individual inmates from a centralized location. The individuals were held in a cell pretty much the entirety of their time incarcerated. They were given small crafts that they could do, shaping rocks similar to like in the Shawshank Redemption, other small crafts. They were also given a Bible to read and to develop penitence about what they had done. Basically, there to reform themselves, to make themselves better through isolation and through study of religion. The second system that was developed in the United States, and the one that was adopted more widely throughout the nation in terms of developing our correctional system, is the New York system. The main difference between the New York system and the Pennsylvania system is how the inmates were allowed to congregate. In the Pennsylvania system, they were all held in isolation. In the New York system, they were allowed to congregate in common areas, but they were expected to be quiet or fairly silent. And then they were returned to their cells at night. The main difference with that is that by having the option to take people out of that environment and put them in isolation, you give the inmates a reason to behave better. If everyone's already in isolation, there's not really much you can do to a person at that point. But by having isolation as a potential punishment, it makes it easier. It basically just gives the jailers, the correctional officers, a larger tool set. They were fairly small cells compared to the Pennsylvania system. They weren't in there all the time, so they didn't need to be quite as big. They also instituted prison labor, having the inmates work at jobs inside the facility and outside the facility. And they also instituted the famous prison stripes, which are put on individuals to identify them quickly in case of an escape. Out of the New York system came the Reformatory Model, the Reformatory movement, trying to basically create early systems of parole. It allowed the inmates to they were classified. You came in on one level, the base level. If you behaved well, you could move up to a higher distinction where you could be paroled. If you behaved poorly, you could move to a lower distinction where then you have to move back up through the ranks before you were going to be eligible for parole or early release. They also offered academic and vocational training to the inmates for the first time, try to give them a better opportunities once they were released from the correctional setting. And again, same thing with having the solitary. Having parole gives the inmate something to strive for. It gives them a reason to behave in a proper manner. instead of just hoping that the inmates behave, which is not a very good policy for running a correctional institution. In recent times, we've seen some pushes towards different types of prison labor. Some of the prison facilities even have their own factories. There's a prison in Georgia that acts as a farm and provides a lot of the food that is eaten by all the inmates in various correctional facilities across the state. Sometimes a company will bring the equipment to a prison. Sometimes the prison will bring the workers to a company. There's a lot of different types of prison labor that have been implemented in the United States. And it's really good for the inmates. It gives them a chance to make more money than they would working in just a basic prison job, doing janitorial work or laundry work or something like that. And sometimes it can help them build skill sets. Another movement that's happened recently in prisons in the United States is the privatization of prisons due to overcrowding issues, due to prison systems being underfunded. There's been a push for states to outsource their correctional work to private companies. This has almost universally resulted in substandard medical care, substandard food, nutritional services, and a general degradation of the conditions that were already very poor in the prison environments. Luckily, President Obama placed intense restrictions on the expansion of privatized prisons right before he left office. Unluckily, immediately after coming into office, the current president removed those restrictions. So if you do a Google search for one of the companies, the Geo Group, you can follow their stock pattern as it dives when President Obama made his decision, and then spikes again with the next administration that came into office, right between September to 2016 to January of 2017. So it's a fun little chart to pull up. Other types of incarceration, a particular type is shock incarceration, and we talked about shock probation. This is a different type of system. Basically, they're talking about boot camps for younger offenders. Boot camps do not work. They have higher recidivism rates than regular incarceration. And the major flaw in boot camps is that you take youth offenders, at-risk youth, oftentimes they've been charged, convicted of felony cases. You put them in this very heavily regimented system, this boot camp system, where every minute of their day is mapped out. Then, when they finish the program, because they've been convicted of felonies, they can't enter the military. So they leave this highly structured system that you put them in. They're systematically prevented from entering into the formal military system, and then they go back to the same shitty neighborhoods that they came from, where they lose all of that structure, all that regiment, and oftentimes they go back into their old patterns of behavior. So there's a lot of publicity about these things. The Rock even did a documentary on HBO about how great he thinks boot camps are, but in practice, in reality, looking at decades of history, they're just as bad, if not worse, than incarcerating youth offenders in juvenile facilities. The federal prison system is not nearly as old as the state level system. The New York system was sort of created in the early parts of the 1800s. The Pennsylvania system goes back to late 1700s. The U.S. Bureau of Prisons is a part of the Justice Department, and it was first started in 1891, where money was given for the department and also for the construction of two prisons. The first two federal prisons to open were the Atlanta prison and the prison at Leavenworth. Leavenworth prison is also the military prison. It's interesting to pull up prisons on Google Maps, and you can see what the facilities look like. You can see the area around them. It's just kind of neat to see. Also, if you're bored, the Google reviews of prisons are fantastic, and I'll just leave it at that. If you want to check that out, that's a good way to waste some time while we're all under quarantine. If you're listening to this lecture in the spring of 2020, if you're listening to it in a future semester, disregard the previous statement. As the need for additional facilities was required, those facilities were built. The first women's facility opening up about 19 years after the first men's facilities. And then the Bureau of Prisons was actually started as its own separate bureaucratic unit in the 1930s. Again, as they had more facilities, it just made more sense to create its own system of bureaucrats to handle the operations of those facilities. The types of federal facilities that we have, U.S. penitentiaries are the maximum security facilities. That's what we have here in Atlanta. There are medium security facilities, the federal correctional institutions, metropolitan correctional centers where inmates awaiting trial, potentially individuals awaiting deportation are held. They also have medical centers where inmates that require special medical care are housed. And then federal prison camps, which is the Club Fed. We actually have one of these in Atlanta as well, where inmates that are very low flight risks, very low security risks are housed. The reason that they are allowed to have things like volleyball courts, tennis courts, no walls, just fences, low security is because they're not a threat. And the lower threat level, the lower security you can implement, the cheaper their incarceration is going to be. There's also the issue of federal detention centers. Some of them are temporary. They're used for different reasons. If individuals have overflow from other facilities, if there are acute legal issues, if people are having to be detained, those facilities are used for those necessities. So it's important to note the difference between prisons and jails. First, prisons are correctional institutions maintained by the federal government and state governments for the confinement of convicted felons. So individuals convicted of felonies go to jail, or go to prison, excuse me. Individuals convicted of felonies go to prison. Jails are run by local governments, and they are for individuals awaiting trial or those convicted of misdemeanors and or felonies that are sentenced to short sentences. Typically, jail is for sentences less than a year. So any misdemeanors typically have a punishment of less than a year. Some felonies have punishments of less than a year. Those individuals will be served their time in jail. Prisons are for individuals convicted of felonies serving sentences longer than a year. Overall, prisons are less dangerous than jails, mainly because jails have more people coming in and out of there. There's more movement of people, which creates uncertain conditions, and all that movement, all the movement of people and places in and out of the facility makes them less safe. There's about 3,500 local jails across the country. If you can't get out of jail before the trial on bail or bond, we talked about those things in the past, then you have to sit in jail until the trial happens, and that could be 6 weeks, it could be 6 months, it could be a year, it could be 2 years, just depending on how backed up the court system is in that area. The types of local prisons, state level prisons that we have, again, similar to the federal system. Supermax in Georgia, that is Reedsville, Georgia State Prison. Maximum security, there's a fair amount of maximum security facilities around the state. Medium security, minimum security, and then open institutions, again, just depending on what threat level the individual has, which is assessed at whenever someone is convicted of a felony in Georgia, they're going to be sent to prison. They spend their first 6 months at Jackson Diagnostics, which is in Jackson, Georgia, and they do psychological assessments, threat assessments, and then decide what facility the individual is going to go to. Other than death row inmates, which are housed at Jackson, that is where death row is. So depending on what threat level you're assessed at Jackson is going to decide what institution you go to, which level of institution you go to. Okay, please remember to read the chapter and to watch the videos that are linked in the to-do list. Contextualize this with the other information that we've learned about the correctional system, and be sure to watch all the videos, review all the PowerPoints, read the chapters that are listed each week.